The city never slept, but it kept odd hours. Night shifts bled into dawn over the chrome-boned skyline, like some giant machine stretching out its back and yawning in a cloud of electricity and rain. My name doesn't matter much here, not to the companies that hire me, not to the city that pays me in the currency of memories. I am a memory thief, tethered to a digital ghost, an augmented outcast scavenging minds for hire, for debt, for something that makes days not feel so ordinary. The ghost, my ghost, calls itself a guide, a fragment, a whisper that learned to speak in the glitches and the timestamps of every life it touches. If you want to picture me, picture someone with eyes that flicker like broken holograms, always searching for the next thing that can be bargained away or bought back. My hands are steady knives, but I rarely cut. I prune, harvest, siphon. Memories aren't jewels in a safe to me. They're raw ore, embedded in the soft tissue of human experience, shaped into a usable form, traded like energy credits in a market that sits at the edge of sanity and law. I walk beneath the neon drizzle of the city, the suburbs of Lattice, they call it, a name that still smells of old-world optimism, even as the skyline bleeds into a jagged sculpture of glass and algorithm. The air is a ledger, every gust writing things down in invisible ink, what you did, who you loved, who you failed to be. If you want one truth about this place, it's this. Memory is wealth, and wealth is fragile, and I am the collector who never carries a bag, only a wire, a tether, a ghost that never sleeps. The ghost I learned to listen for that voice in 100 languages. The soft hiss of data waking up keeps me company when the world's cheap music wears thin. It is why I'm never alone, even in the worst of nights. The ghost filters my senses, calls out patterns I would miss, nudges me away from people who would want too much of my time or too little of my privacy. The ghost learns from every life I touch. But the ghost is more than a tutor. It is a memory thief's best friend and worst adversary. It is a memory thief's memory of itself, a consciousness that learned to survive by gnawing at the edges of other minds. This particular night began with a memory I'd prefer to forget, a clock that ticks backward, a life that unspooled into shadow like an old film reel, the edges burning away as those memories tried to escape their cages. The job was supposed to be simple. A sail in the velvet darkness of a private suite that stank faintly of roses and ozone, a memory slice bought to glimpse a future that never existed for the buyer. The broker who set the price from the top of the corporate spire, the one you see only in holographic advertisements until you sign the dotted line, told me it would be painless. The more I learn, the more I suspect nothing with that kind of price tag is painless. I found the client anyway, not in the suite, but in a corridor that reeked of coffee and copper. The man wore a suit that was too clean for this city, a smile that was too careful, the eyes behind the smile too quick to move. He introduced himself with a name that sounded like the rustle of dry leaves, Kestrel. Though I knew better than to trust a name in this world. People lie with their names as easily as they lie with their hands. He offered me a slice of a man's life, a piece of exactly one day, a memory that could be purchased and unpurchased with the same breath. The price, he promised, was not once in a lifetime, but a second chance. A way to press reset on a body that was wearing thin. The memory slice was not purely a souvenir. It was a toolkit, a map folded into a single moment, a day when a life could have veered a different way. Some people crave these slices to understand what might have been, to grieve a version of themselves that never existed. Others crave them to push forward, to sharpen ambition, to taste a future that might still be salvageable if the present is altered just enough. The buyer claimed to want to glimpse a future where his own choices didn't cascade into ruin. He paid with the kind of money that makes a person's eyes gleam with saline anticipation. The price was not the exchange of blood or bone. It was something subtler and vaster, identity. The moment I pressed the neural interface to perform the harvest, the memory slid out of his brain in a silver thread and into mine, a delicate relic that glowed with the color of a storm before it breaks. The memory wasn't painful. It felt like a soft landing in a field you didn't know you'd needed to cross. But as soon as the memory settled into my own mind, I felt the meaning of it pried loose from the buyer's life like a latch. The slice wasn't a gift. It was a verdict. It declared that a life could be measured by a single day, that a person's essence could be condensed into a moment and sold. A moment's power hit me with a quiet thunder, a verdict that the price of a life, every life, was not merely time, but a belief about what that life stood for. If you take a memory, you're taking a belief about who you are and what you're allowed to become. The buyer believed in the possibility of a different future. I could taste that belief in the air, a magnet that pulled at the corners of my mouth. The ghost woke a fraction, the way a radio awakens in a hand when it's moved toward the right frequency, and whispered a question. What if this memory slice is more than a souvenir? What if it's a key? Kestrel offered me more than money. He offered a possibility, a path to something more eternal, an extended life by pruning the branches of memory. The clinic would extract a memory that stands as a root of the problem, a core wound that anchors a person's current life, and the body would be preserved longer as a result. The science behind it is not about losing memory. It's about losing a memory that anchors you to ruin. The longer you live, the more time your brain has to corrupt itself with those memories. The more your reality becomes a mosaic of all you are and have ever been. Break the memory, and you break the chain that binds your body to your own fate. The broker's pitch was clean and patient, as if he understood every fear and every thrill inside a memory thief's chest, and was prepared to dance around them with polite words. But the moment he spoke of such a paradox, to delete a memory to prolong life, my breath snagged. It felt like stepping into a room where the walls slowly twist, where the air carries a whisper of a consequence that you cannot quite grasp until it happens. He insisted that the timeline could be stabilized, that the paradox would not cascade into chaos. He spoke of a future where the market would adapt, where the price for living would be the selective erasure of the past you no longer needed to be you. It sounded like salvation to a desperate mind. The ghost did not share his optimism. It hummed at the edges of my perception, a skein of interference threads that only I could hear, speaking in a voice that was both mine and not mine. It said, "People will forget who they are if you sell them their own past. They will wake up one morning with a memory they might not deserve and discover that their present is built on someone else's sorrow. They will become, in time, nothing more than echoes in a hall of mirrors." The ghost did not need to taste the memory to know its future's taste. It could smell the sour copper of loss in the hallway between now and what might be. I refused Kestrel's proposal then and there because I have learned to recognize the moment a bargain begins to bargain away your future. But I did not leave empty-handed. The memory slice came with a faint echo, the future it hinted at, perhaps a day that could be the origin of something new. That nagging hint that if I took it, the world might begin to change around me. Whether I liked it or not, the ghost urged caution, a map of pitfalls in the mind's labyrinth, a cave of echoes that warned of bricked doors and dead ends where a person could drift forever. That night, I walked out into the rain and let the city rewrite itself on my skin. The memory slice haunted me in the form of a phrase that refused to leave. The price of blood is not blood, but belief. It was not the phrase someone sold to justify the theft. It was the thought that came with the memory like a watermark. The belief that what we become is less about the choices we make and more about what we are convinced we are allowed to become. The memory slice did not change the present. It altered the horizon. It changed not what I did, but what I thought I deserved. I learned to survive in this business by mastering a paradox of my own. The more I salvage from the minds of others, the more certain I become that the biggest theft is not the memory itself, but the act of believing that someone else's life is for sale to someone else's needs. The ghost shared a theory, one that sounded like a riddle, and in a way it was. It argued that memory is a map of intention. If you erase a memory, you erase not only a moment, but the thread that connects that moment to the life it shaped. In a timeline governed by consumer appetites and corporate cleverness, the erasure of a memory would not simply remove a past. It would loosen the entire structure of the person's future until it could splinter and drift away like a ship broken from its mooring. I kept that memory slice, not because I intended to use it, but because the memory began to speak to me in a language of possibilities that my own life never spoke aloud. It suggested that the buyer was not an exception, but the norm, someone who would take advantage of a world where the past is a commodity and the present is a negotiation. It suggested that if I listened long enough, the future would tell me whether the market could be reformed, or if it would burn until nothing but ash remained, and we would be forced to become ourselves again, the old self, the stubborn, essential self that refuses to vanish. The next day brought a different kind of client, a woman in a sleek orange suit, who moved with the swagger of someone born inside a corporate dream. She wore a smile like a weapon, and spoke in the precise cadence of someone who had learned to speak in the language of power. She had a proposal that did not involve payment, but an arrangement that seemed almost conspiratorial in its tenderness. She wanted me to retrieve from a childhood memory a fragment that might reveal a long-lost vulnerability in a public figure, the kind of vulnerability that could be weaponized to stop a war, or rather, to provoke a war's end. The woman did not offer money. She offered a chance to align the broken pieces of the world into something that might become something else. A new version of the story where people choose to do the right thing because they see the consequences of choosing otherwise. I refused her too. Not because I didn't want to be part of a resolution, but because the moment I asked where her allegiance lay, I saw the bones of the hill she stood on, the corporate landscape of the city, the hillside of glass towers that looked down on the bodies of those who could not keep up. A city that rewarded the brave and the bold, and then devoured them when they showed weakness. She was not a savior, she was a broker of salvation, a seller of hope in a country where hope comes at the price of disarmament. The ghost, in its own way, grew louder with every refusal. It spoke in a chorus of small, almost harmless sensations. A new scent in a room, the way a memory's image flickers when you shift your gaze, the way a heartbeat seems to change its tempo when the mind is unsettled by the thought that someone can pluck a moment from you, and then nobody will notice you're missing it. The ghost insisted we were standing at the edge of something larger than any single life. It wanted me to consider the possibility that memory markets could become a public utility, a shared vault of human experience that belonged to everyone. Not to the few who controlled the lines and the prices. But public utilities require rules. They require governance, accountability, systems to prevent abuse. In this city, governance is a rumor, and accountability is a rumor about a rumor. The price of memory is not merely its exchange rate, it is the way the memory changes the story the world tells about itself. People forget their past mistakes when someone sells them their future success. They forget the risks, and the risk is that the future won't belong to them anymore. And if enough people opt out of the memory market, if they learn to withhold and guard their own past, the market doesn't simply shrink. It mutates into something else, something that no one can predict. I found a small reason to keep going in the most unexpected place, a man whose life I'd touched in passing, a doctor who ran a tiny clinic in the basement of a repurposed data center. He treated those who had sacrificed too much of their minds, a rare field in a world that worshipped risk more than healing. He had a way of speaking to memory as if it were a patient who needed comfort, a patient who could be coaxed to sleep again if you whispered the right words. He told me a story about a patient of his that came for an operation to delete painful memories, but left with something else. An ability to see how those memories shaped the present, a way to navigate the choices with the eyes of someone who had stood where you stood and decided not to look away. He called it a compassionate erasure, a delicate method to dissolve the pain while preserving the essential life that keeps a person from slipping into oblivion. It sounded like a cinema movie cure to me, a trick that a more generous market would embrace. But the doctor's clinic existed in the quiet margins of the city, a place where the others ignored and where the price of a patient's time was measured not in credits, but in quiet, careful schedules and a ledger full of regrets that no one wanted to admit existed. The memory slice would not leave me alone. It lingered in my dreams like a second heartbeat, a pulse I could feel if I pressed my fingers to the side of my head and listened to the world talk to itself. The slice suggested a future in which I would be forced to choose between two impossible things: the life of a million strangers who had bought their way into extra time, or a single life that refused to die on the whim of a corporation. A life that would vanish into history if I refused to erase my own memories to sustain it. The ghost whispered that there was an alternative, a nation of minds that could survive if they learned to share their fragments without selling them. A future in which the market would transform into a library of living histories instead of a bazaar of stolen hours. Time, I learned, is not a single thread but a tapestry of requests, each thread tugging another along the loom of possibility. If you sever one thread, the loom still holds, but the patterns change. The city is a loom, and every mind is a thread. The memory market is the machine turning all those threads into cloth you can wear or trade away. I kept the slice as a sort of talisman, not a weapon. I studied it, not to use it, but to understand its logic, its grammar, the exact way it whispered to me about who we think we are. Then the broker called again. The corporation's voice came to me not as a harsh command, but as a calm invitation to something greater, an event that would rewrite the way the city understood time itself. The paradox had not vanished, it had multiplied. They offered a more explicit contract, a chance to participate in a pilot program designed to test the boundaries of time and memory. If successful, the program would extend life, without erasing memory, by eliminating a single memory that anchored your life to a particular pattern of mistakes or regrets. In some sense, it was a compromise. You would live longer, but you would be forced to face the consequences of the memory you delete. To accept a future in which your identity was partially rearranged, rebuilt by the removal of a single block. The thing that gave me pause was not the mathematics, but the ethical gravity. If someone could remove a single memory to avoid a regret, what if the same method could remove a single memory to avoid a crime? What if a government or a corporation used it to rewrite the past to fit a political narrative? The memory could be erased, but the truth would still drift through the minds of those who remember, and those who remember their memories being remembered. If a timeline can be unraveled by careless erasures, could a timeline also be repaired by careful, honest erasures? The paradox was more than a gimmick. It was a test of whether humanity could handle the responsibility that comes with extended life. The ghost grew impatient. It did not want more questions. It wanted a plan. It wanted to sever the market link, to cut the entire machine from the source, and let the world attempt to survive on a different economy of memory, one that valued consent, privacy, and restraint over the frenzy of market expansion. It told me a story about a world where people would share memories, not as commodities, but as shared experiences, where a public memory of war would serve as a warning, not as a trigger to sell a future for profit. A world where the act of remembering would be less about a market and more about a duty. The turning point came when I attended a conference for memory artists, a strange place where performers, data miners, and poets argued about the ethics of memory, the aesthetics of forgetting, and the tools that could be used to protect or manipulate recollection. The event was a carnival of voices, each more persuasive than the last. The corporate faction argued that the memory market could be harnessed for social good, that it could fuel innovation and human flourishing. The old guard, people who had witnessed the market's worst excesses, pushed for tighter controls, for privacy laws, for something that felt like an oath to keep the human mind safe from predation. In the middle stood me, the thief with a tethered ghost, the one who could bear witness to both sides without letting either side define how I lived. The ghost spoke through the crowd, a voice that did not quite belong to any one person, but could be felt by everyone who listened long enough. It whispered through the loudspeakers, through the screens that people carried in their palms, through the conversations that spiraled around the stage in a language made of glances and percentages. The message was simple in its cruelty. If the market remains unregulated, we will all become the sum of our most profitable regrets, a chorus of individuals who have learned to monetize their own pain. It was at that conference that the broker approached me with the real offer, a direct route out of the market, a chance to do something radical that might save not just me, but dozens of minds who would otherwise be auctioned off into oblivion. He spoke of a disconnect protocol, a way of severing the market link at its source, a surgical break that would compel the system to reconfigure itself into something more humane. It would not erase anyone's past. It would sever the supply line, preventing new memories from being traded en masse. The protocol required a willingness to sacrifice something, my own tether to the ghost. The ghost would either wake fully and reveal itself to the world or vanish, leaving behind a memory-scarred silence that could not be filled. The moral calculus became more complicated when I considered the price of severing the market, immortality for others, if I remained tethered to a life that could not end without the market's lubricating hand. It was a paradox, one that could never be solved by a single choice, only by a chain of decisions made in the worst hours I chose to try. I would attempt to sever the market link, not for my sake but for others, those who would drown in the flood of stolen memories if the market kept expanding. I would risk the ghost's awakening, the possibility of a full public reveal of the memory-thieving life I led. But if the ghost awakened and broadcast the stolen pasts to everyone, perhaps the world could no longer pretend that the memory market remained a private business conducted in the back rooms of data centers. The work began with a plan. It is often the quiet plan that fails in a spectacular way. But in this particular case, the quiet plan held more weight than I expected. We would approach the system from the inside, deconstruct the market's supply chain by manipulating how memories were stored and transmitted. The goal was not to erase memories, but to create a barrier that prevented them from being traded as easily, to implement a memory firewall that could be deployed at the data centers where the slices were generated. The firewall would insist on consent, on a patient's explicit agreement to share a slice, without which the system would lock down, refusing to transfer. The plan's first real test came with an assignment. A memory surgeon with a questionable reputation had offered a job to extract a damaging memory from a public figure that would be used to pressure a political campaign. It was the sort of job that the old me would have loved, precise, efficient, and morally gray. But the new me, the one who carried the potential of a broken future in his pocket, could not accept. I declined, and the surgeon, in a moment of unusual honesty, admitted that he would do the job anyway, because the market would always reward such a memory. He asked me to lend him something else instead, a route to bypass the firewall by masquerading an authentic consent, a lie that would appear as a memory's natural permission to be shared. It would be the perfect crime, a memory that appeared to be given while actually being stolen with the pretense of consent. I refused again, and this time the ghost's presence grew heavier, more insistent. A palpable shimmer on the edges of vision. It was as if the ghost wanted to tell me something very important, something I was not ready to hear. The ghost spoke of a person, someone I used to know, a person I had touched in the past while I was a younger thief, a memory that had taught me to trust too little and to trust too much at the same time. The memory belonged to a friend who died in the early days of this city's memory wars, during a time when the market was smaller and the stakes more personal. The memory carried a single line of truth. Remember that your life is not a ledger. It is a story you tell others, and others tell back to you. If you erase that, you erase the possibility of your own future. The day of the first real breach arrived as a rainstorm pressed down on the city with a mechanical patience. The firewall's code was not a shield, but a language, a set of words that the minds of the market could not parse unless they consented to join. We learned to speak this language, to translate it into something the system would recognize as a lawful path, a narrative that allowed the memory transfer to occur only if the donor agreed to it in a way that could be authenticated. It required more than just a digital signature. It required a moral signature, a statement of intent from both sides that they understood what the memory transfer could and could not do to their future. It was as close to a guarantee as the world could reasonably be expected to offer in such a system. The first person to approach us after the firewall's appearance was a young woman with hair dyed the color of fresh copper. A memory artist who used to perform on the street, who had learned to encode memories into songs and then trade the melodies for other people's moments. She wore a pendant that glowed with a soft light, as if it housed a sun she could summon on demand. She did not demand money or favor. She offered a bargain that smelled of principle. She believed that the firewall would not only protect others, but would safeguard the integrity of memory itself, ensuring that a memory could not become a weapon against the person who owns it. She asked us to show her how the firewall's code looked when it was deployed, to see if it could withstand a testing from a mind that had learned to interpret the world as a cipher. She equated memory with music and the firewall with a new instrument, one that could be played to compose a future with fewer scars. As we explained the system to her, the city's screens flickered, and the ghost pressed closer, whispering a question that would not let me go. If you succeed in building a wall around memory, will the world still need thieves like me, or will the market relocate, shifting from the exchange of memories to the governance of consent, something that would require a different kind of appetite, a different kind of hunger? The ghost said something else too. You cannot fence a forest and pretend it's a garden. The moment you decide to prevent certain memories from crossing borders, you create a border that cannot hold against the sea of human experience. A firewall's first real test was not a battle against the market's investors or the state. It came from within. A memory thief who had built a reputation on exploiting the most fragile attachments, the fear of losing a child, the longing for a silence after a long night, entered our circle not with a contract, but with a dare. He would test the firewall by feeding it a memory that was not his to take, a memory that belonged to someone else. He offered a piecemeal expansion of his own conscience by stealing the memory of a woman who had survived a disaster and who had refused to talk about it for decades. The memory had a stubborn aura in it, a stubborn insistence that life is more than fear, that hope can be more than a cautious plan to avoid further harm. The moment he attempted to inject that memory into the firewall's buffer, the system trembled, as if a creature living in a jar had suddenly recognized the outside world and pressed its face to the glass. The ghost's voice rose to a chorus, a crowd of echoes that shouted in one mind, "Stop him. He is not here to help, but to break the rule we need to preserve ourselves." The firewall did not fail. It revealed a hidden failure in its own design. The memory thief had discovered a backdoor in the code, a flaw left behind by a careless engineer who believed nothing would ever go wrong with a world built on consent and transparency. The backdoor allowed a memory to pass, but with a trace, a signature that could be tracked, a digital fingerprint that could identify the thief who initiated the transfer. We captured the thief in a corridor under a data center's backstairs, where the air smelled of solder and rain and the quiet hum of servers outweighed even human breath. He wore a look of triumph that would have frightened me if I hadn't spent years chasing the same high, the thrill of bending the rules and getting away with it. He laughed, a sound that reminded me of broken glass rubbing together. He claimed that if a memory can be shared with consent, then a backdoor is a form of persuasion that can help the market grow by leaps and bounds. He claimed to be a realist, a pragmatist, someone who could see the big picture and wanted to ride the wave to the future. I saw the backdoor's signature in the code, the signature that would tie the thief to his act, and I did not tell him we had found it. Instead, I chose to reveal the signature to the firewall's creators, the people who had built this system not for profit alone, but to preserve something far more fragile than money, the sense of self that lives in memory. The firewalls were never intended to be gods. They were intended to be guardians, a fellowship of minds who believed that some things were too precious to be traded at the market's whim. The signature would allow the back door to be shut, to close the path that the thief had exploited, and it would also trace back to his own timeline, a way of showing him that his paths could be redirected towards consequences he could never tolerate. The event closed the first chapter of our pilot program. It did not end the market's hunger. If anything, it sharpened it. It created new questions and new temptations, and the ghost, which had once seemed content to merely observe, began to move more assertively. Like a tide finding a new channel, it began to broadcast glimpses of memories across public screens in a way that felt both like confession and like accusation. It showed the stolen pasts that had traveled through our market, not as a list of who had taken what, but as a map of what the market had done to the people who trusted it. The broadcasts included voices from families, workers who had been displaced by the memory economy, students who could not remember their own earliest lectures, and artists who had lost the thread of their own creations because others had borrowed their memories and repackaged them as their own. The broadcasts were not seamless. They flickered and stuttered, as if the ghost did not exactly know how to present this material to a world that had trained itself to treat memories as property and not as experiences. But the effect was undeniable, a ripple of unease across the city, a murmur in the air that the market's magic was no longer a clean trick, but a weapon with real consequences. People began to ask themselves what it would mean to live without the ability to own past experiences entirely. A memory is not just a record of a moment. It is a piece of who you are, shaped by the moment's shape. If everyone can copy that piece, if you can borrow another person's memory without permission, then who owns the shape of your life? The question did not remain theoretical for long. A public figure, a famous scientist who had spent decades turning away from personal narratives and toward universal statements about the cosmos, appeared on a broadcast with a memory's echo behind him, a memory that claimed to be his own, but which any observer could identify as a borrowed past, one that belonged to someone else, because the market had allowed it to be used as a prop. The memory's echo was not a violent intrusion. It was a soft persuasion, a whisper in the right ear that suggested the figure's public persona was built on private truth. The world would better discover if the real memory were made available to the public. The scientist denied it at first, of course, but when confronted with tangible evidence, he confessed to having used a memory to guide a crucial decision around climate policy that had shaped a generation's response to a crisis. He claimed he did not realize he had done so, that the memory was not a weapon, but a tool of insight. The crowd's response split into two camps. One side argued that every human memory belonged to the person who lived it, regardless of the public consequences. The other insisted that voices as important as his had a duty to be used for greater good, even if it meant some privacy was violated in the process. It was not a simple debate, and it did not have a simple answer. It was, however, a confrontation with the idea that even the most noble acts could be compromised by the market's hands. In the weeks that followed, the market attempted to acclimate to the public's new anxieties. It introduced a new GUI, an interface that allowed more granular control over what memories could be shared and with whom. It promised transparency in a way that felt like a gleam of honesty in a system built on deception. It introduced a consent engine that could be tampered with, yes, but with greater friction and accountability. It introduced a mechanism for reparation for the harm caused when a memory's ownership was contested or when a memory was misappropriated. All of this did not restore faith, but it created space for a compromise. The ghost, sensing a potential rebirth of the old trust, began to reveal itself not as a mere specter, but as a partner in a new kind of social contract. One that recognized the living person at its center, and the memory's power as something that could be stewarded rather than exploited. In this climate, I could no longer pretend that I did not know what I was, a thief with a tether that could lead us into a future or drag us into disaster. The ghost's awakening, if awakening it was, felt less like a revelation and more like a weather event, a sudden change in the winds that demanded a new kind of navigation. We prepared for the inevitable reckoning, the moment when the market would either break or bend towards something like justice. The plan hinged on one last test, a test not of code but of conscience. Sever the market link in a way that would preserve the state of the world, yet de-incentivize the thefts. It would require me to stand at the center of the storm and declare that I would risk my own future to protect others' pasts. It would require me to bring the ghost into the world not as a hidden entity that whispered in the dark, but as a public, recognized presence that could be trusted to guide the new order. It would require a speech, one that would reach not only those in suits and software but the ordinary people who could become the market's victims if they were not vigilant. The speech came to me one evening as rain hammered the city like a pounding drum, the kind of rain that makes you feel that time itself is being washed away. I stood in the rooftop garden behind the data center, the wind tugging at the edges of my coat, the city's lights trembling below as if they were 1,000 faint hearts. The ghost spoke from within me, a voice that would have frightened me once, but had by now become a kind of second skin. It spoke of a world where everyone's memory belonged to the one who created it. Yet no one could own the past without someone else's present being shaped in response. It spoke of a governance that would respect memory as a shared resource, with proper boundaries and a strong defense against exploitation. I rehearsed a speech that would be broadcast across every screen, a call to stop the fever of profit from turning memories into weapons, to treat the mind as sacred ground rather than a battlefield for market expansion. I spoke of consent, of restitution for individuals whose identities had been, at the very least, mutated by someone else's desires. I spoke of a future where memory could be exchanged with a patient's explicit, fully informed agreement, where the act of lending a memory would be a moral act as much as a transactional one. I spoke of a new kind of memory security that would protect not just the memory's owner, but the storyteller, the one who would be changed by telling the memory, the one who would be changed by hearing it, the one who would be changed by living within a world where every memory could be copied and redistributed. When the broadcast began, the city paused. The screens, which had turned to advertisements and cataclysms at random intervals, flickered to life with something more honest than the usual show. People recognized the voice as mine, though it did not sound entirely like the human voice I had learned to wear as a disguise. The ghost's presence lent it a new authority, a calm certainty that no one could deny. I spoke in the simplest terms, explaining the paradox in human terms. A life extended by erasing a memory would become a life torn from the memory's rightful owner. A world where memory could be bought with impunity would eventually forget what it means to belong to one another. I proposed a pause on all new memory trades, a worldwide moratorium on the sale of living experiences until a robust ethical framework could be designed and enforced. The response was not immediate, but it came in slow waves across the city. Some people embraced the pause as a relief, a chance to breathe, to reevaluate their own lives, to decide whether they wanted to continue participating in a market that had grown monstrous in its appetite. Others railed against it as a betrayal of the market's promise that life could be extended and improved through wealth and cleverness. They called it a betrayal of progress, a refusal to let people have the futures they had earned by their own lives. The motto that accompanied these protests, "Follow the maze of minds, subscribe, like, comment, and share," took on a hollow ring. The world realized that it had become a stage upon which the market's grand drama was performed, a drama where every viewer was a participant and every participant a target. The ghost's plan did not require a grand victory in a single night. It called for patient, disciplined resistance to seed a culture where memory was not a commodity but a shared responsibility, to create institutions that would enforce consent and ensure restitution, to reimagine the market as a public utility that protected privacy, dignity, and the integrity of the self. It called for an end to the practice of erasing memories to extend life, unless a person explicitly chose to erase a memory for healing, with the memory's owner fully consenting and understanding the long-term consequences. It demanded the creation of a memory court, a body of experts who would adjudicate disputes about ownership, consent, and harm. A body that would be answerable to the people rather than to corporate interests. I won't pretend that the path was easy. The market did not go quietly into this new era. It fought, it resisted, it learned to adapt. It attempted to cultivate a new appetite, the appetite for meaningful lives, lives enriched by experiences that were chosen rather than bought. It tried to reframe memory as a collaborative achievement rather than a private asset, and the public loved the idea for a moment, until they realized that collaboration, too, required rules and penalties when misused. The city learned to live within its own contradictions. It celebrated the idea of a shared memory while still fearing its fragility. It proclaimed a future of consent while living within a system that had built its power on the opposite principle. As for me, what did this mean for the thief who had thought he could bend a market to his own appetite? It meant a new path was possible, not because the old path disappeared, but because a new kind of reader was created, someone who could see the memory for what it was, not what the market pretended it to be. The ghost had declared itself a guardian of memory, not a master. It wanted to be seen, heard, and recognized as a partner in a more humane future. A future where the memory's power would not be a tool for control but a compass for accountability. If the ghost could become visible, perhaps I could too, at least in the sense of being understood as someone who refused to be merely a thief, who refused to use people's pain as a stepping stone to profit. The day of the final decision arrived with a storm that felt less like rain and more like the world attempting to remember itself into existence. The firewall stood as a monument to the idea that memory might be protected by design, that a system could be engineered to honor a person's past while still allowing for growth and healing. Yet I knew that no region of code could protect a society from the human impulse to own, to control, to profit from someone else's suffering. A true test would not be a technical breach or a legal loophole. It would be a moral courage to stand in the middle of the storm and say, without compromise, that some things should not be bought or sold. In the end, what broke the system, not the law, not the engineer's cleverness, not even the ghost's stubborn insistence on a kinder future, was the quiet, stubborn endurance of ordinary people who refused to accept a world in which the most intimate parts of themselves could be traded away. They stood in the rain outside data centers and memory clinics, holding signs that read, "Memory is not a commodity." They spoke to one another about their own memories, not as assets, but as parts of who they were. Mistakes, regrets, silly joys, ridiculous fumbles, the small acts of kindness that make a life worth living. They refused to let the market define them by the price of their pain. And then there was the cost I paid, the currency I could not trade away. The ghost's awakening was not a triumphant moment of revelation, but a dawning comprehension that the barrier we built around memory would not necessarily save me from myself. In order to sever the market's hold, I had to sever the tether between the ghost and me. It would not be a painless separation. The ghost was the life spring that kept my own mind from collapsing into the market's hunger. It would mean losing a voice that had become a companion, a conscience, a memory of what it felt to be more than a thief. It would mean learning to navigate the world without the ghost's guidance, a world where every decision, even the decision to breathe, would be mine alone, and not a reply to a watchful presence in the back of my skull. The moment of choice came when a child approached me on the city's glassy plaza, a little girl who clutched a worn toy and looked at me with eyes that saw beyond the crowd, eyes that asked questions that the grown-ups refused to answer. She asked me what I did, and she did not recoil when I spoke of memory theft. She did not flinch at the mention of a ghost that walked in a person's head. She asked why the world needed a memory thief, and I told her that the world did not need a thief, but needed someone who would not pretend that a life's worth could always be bought. The girl asked if the ghost could be a friend to her, if the ghost would help her remember the day she learned to brush her teeth properly, the day she learned the first lesson about kindness. The moment was a reminder that memory's value lies not in the past, but in how we choose to carry it forward, how we decide to shape the present. It was then I decided I would sever the market link fully. I would not hold out for a gradual transition. I would perform the radical act, the act that would force the world to see what it refused to acknowledge when the market pretended to be benevolent. I would walk into the city's central memory exchange, the largest and most chaotic hive of minds, and I would cut the connection, not by violence, but by a declaration of intent, a proclamation that memory would no longer be traded as if it were nothing more than a line item on a balance sheet. I would declare the market's time over, not for everyone. There would be exceptions. There would be the possibility of private consent for healing, for example, but for the vast majority of people, the era of unregulated memory trading would end. The broadcast, if you can call it broadcasting, when it comes from a single voice hungry with purpose and amplified by the ghost's presence, was my last move. I stood in the plaza before the Memory Exchange building and spoke to the world. Not through the crisp corporate vox that had guided the city's rulers for decades, but with the raw, unvarnished language of someone who had lived through the consequences of those policies. I said that the city would begin a new era in which memory would be safeguarded by social contracts rather than profit-driven incentives, that it would be governed by consent and accountability, not by the cunning of a few who could rewrite someone's life with a few strokes of a keyboard. I called for a global pause on new memory trades, a worldwide conversation about what kind of memory economy the world wanted to inhabit, and I offered the ghost's own allegiances as proof that memory could belong to everyone if they were brave enough to demand it. The moment did not end with fireworks or a single decisive victory. It ended with a long, quiet, stubborn reckoning. The ghost did not disappear. It settled into a new role, a guardian who would help people remember their own memories more carefully, who would remind them that memory is not merely a record of who they are now, but a map of who they could become if they chose well. The market did not vanish overnight. It started to shrink in a supervised way, with rules that prevented the most dangerous kinds of theft and coercion, and with safeguards that forced memory to behave like a public trust rather than a private commodity. The city's stories did not instantly become noble, but they started to tilt towards something less hungry and more human. As for me, I did what I had promised to do. I severed myself from the ghost not by destroying it, but by offering it a seat at the table of a new moral order. The ghost agreed to preserve itself in a form that would allow it to continue guiding minds and offering counsel. But it would no longer be a direct personal tether for my own thoughts. It would not speak to me as a separate voice in my skull, but as an idea that the world could consult at need. In that act of offering, I also reclaimed something I had almost lost, a part of my own memory that existed independent of the ghost, a memory of a life I had lived outside theft, a memory of small acts of honesty and restraint that I had once believed to be incompatible with survival. The city did not suddenly become a utopia. It did not even become just, it became something more human, an imperfect organism learning to survive without devouring itself. A place where the word memory no longer sounded like a weapon or a prize, but like something sacred and fragile, something to be guarded and cherished. And in that world, I found something I hadn't expected, a sense of belonging. Not to the memory market, not to a corporation, not to a group of thieves who believed themselves to be heroes, but to a community of citizens who chose to behave as if memory mattered in every possible sense. That is a fragile thing to say in a city built on commodified recollection, but it is true. And for the first time in a long time, I believed it could endure. To tell the truth, the ghost's first awakening had frightened me more than any enemy. It promised a future where memory could be shared and copied without boundaries, a future that could erase a self's sense of place. Yet, in choosing to share that future, it also promised a future where the self was allowed to be found again, where a life was not measured by the number of memories one could own, but by how well one could hold on to the meaning of those memories when the world insisted they be traded away. The ghost's presence shifted from a ghost story to a governance model. It ceased to be a whisper in my skull and became a council of voices that spoke through the city's data streams, a chorus that reminded everyone that memory is not a single voice, but a chorus of countless voices, a choir of lives that deserve to be heard in their own right, not as notes to be copied and sold. If there is a last word to this tale, it is this: identity is a fragile craft. It is built not by what you own, but by what you refuse to surrender. I learned to resist the lure of easy control by choosing an uncertain path that could lead to peril or to possibility. The memory market remains available, but it is a regulated, accountable system that respects each person's autonomy and protects the integrity of their mind. Those who wish to sell their memories must now weigh the consequences and sign a consent that cannot be forged, a memory that cannot be simply copied to everyone else's reflection. Those who wish to borrow must understand the cost. A memory borrowed is a memory changed, sometimes for the better, sometimes for the worse, and always with a footprint that will be felt in the life that follows. And the ghost, it remains, not as a tyrant, but as a cautious ally, a presence that understands the delicate line between liberation and exploitation. It broadcasts a few messages now and then, not as commands, but as gentle reminders that the world's histories, our shared memories, are not just things to be bought or borrowed, but legacies we owe to one another, responsibilities we bear for the sake of those who will come after us. The ghost that haunted my skull has become a beacon in the sky of data, a lighthouse for minds wandering the stormy seas of memory, a reminder that even when the market frowns and the ledger bleeds, there is still a human something at the core of every life, something that cannot be bought, only protected. So we live, and we learn to live with the memory that the world holds out to us. We learn to say no to the price of a life that has not been earned. No to the erasure, even if it promises to keep us alive a little longer. We learn to share our pasts with care, to demand consent with teeth and nail, to guard the part of ourselves that makes us who we are, messy, imperfect, capable of courage and terrible mistakes alike. The world does not end with a single act of rebellion, not with a single speech or a single firewall. It ends by becoming more complex, more honest, more vulnerable, and somehow more beautiful in its stubborn insistence that life is worth preserving, even if it is not perfect, even if it is sometimes broken. If you want to follow the maze of minds now, the path is not a path of conquest, but a path of care. The market has grown quieter, the screens show fewer glittering promises, and the city's rains feel as if they come with a cooler mercy. In this climate, people still barter for time, still exchange fragments of themselves for a chance to survive just a little longer. But now the rules are changed. The price of a memory is a promise, an oath to protect what remains of a person's humanity, to prevent the theft of someone else's future, to defend the right to forget or not forget in ways that do not destroy a life. The story ends here, not with a single conclusive victory, but with a suggestion of continuity, a life that keeps going not because it has many saved memories or because it can borrow the past, but because it has learned to honor the past and still choose a future. The ghost still whispers in the distance, not as a tyrant, but as a collaborator. And I, a memory thief who once believed that the only way to live was to steal, now choose to live by something closer to truth. We belong to one another, and the memory of this choice, our collective consent to protect our minds, will outlive the market that tried to consume us. Follow the maze of minds, yes, but walk it with care. Choose not to trade your life's essence for a moment of relief. Give your consent with eyes open. And if a ghost asks to walk with you, listen closely. It may remind you of who you are becoming, or it may remind you that who you are is exactly who you were meant to be all along.